This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is the second of 3 episodes over the quest for Confederate treasure, which follows Bob Brewer as he hunts for rebel gold. One of the deadliest, wealthiest, most secretive and efficient spy and underground organizations in the history of the world was the Knights of the Golden Circle, which operated over the globe for 65 years, from 1851 to 1916. Some of the craftiest, finest brains in the South directed the activities of the Knights of the Golden Circle. From Jesse James was one of his names, the greatest cover-up in history by the famous outlaw who lived 73 incredible lives. In the last episode, I told y'all about Bob's uncovering of an incredible map and grid of symbols and buried artifacts that pointed to rebel gold that was possibly buried by the Knights of the Golden Circle, of whom I talked extensively about. I gave the whole history of them. I then switched from Bob's story after he found the glass jar of loot. I switched from Bob to the history of the KGC. In this episode, I continue Bob's exciting story before diving into one of the most infamous outlaw heroes in American history, Jesse James. After his discovery of gold in the woods, Bob immediately bought a better metal detector, and he continued the search. His first stop was an old abandoned house that had belonged to a Spanish-American war veteran named Jess Goat, nickname Browns. He was known for burying gold and money around his heels. But in 1930, he died mysteriously. Well, Bob found yet another jar full of old American coins, all minted between 1871 and 1919. Although he was extremely excited, he just found some treasure, he knew this find wasn't quite like the others. It wasn't connected to the KGC rebel gold with the map and symbols. It wasn't connected to his ancestors. Although he'd later changed his mind about both those facts. But for now, this find was just to test his new equipment and the validity of old rumors he had heard since he was a kid. Bob would, soon after he found the gold, tell a non-local fellow treasure hunter and weirdo named Bob Smith. Let's just call him Evil Bob. Evil Bob would betray our Bob and steal a whole bunch more gold from Jess Goat Brown's place right under Bob's nose. It was a crappy thing to do. Evil Bob would also tear Bob's friends away from him. Childhood friends. But Evil Bob being evil, he would betray them as well, and then all 3 local men would become friends again. These 3 men, Bob Brewer, Bob Tilley, and Don Fretz, would be lifelong friends, and they'll come up again. They vowed to keep Evil Bob in the dark from now on. Bob Tilley, there are a lot of Bobs, Bob Tilley, his ancestors lived near Grandpa Ashcraft, and his family's name was the Avants. Bob would soon come to learn the Avants family was also deeply involved in the conspiracy Bob was literally digging up. Undeterred by Evil Bob's treachery, Good Bob pursued another lead. Back in town, he talked to a 92-year-old who believed that Albert Pike, the leader of the Freemasons and possible KGC leader, and the Civil War schemer, and Confederate general, Albert Pike probably buried treasure at his cabin that he stayed at until marauders came to kill him one night. Well, this old-timer told Bob that his grandfather had built the Pike cabin all those years ago, and Pike had paid his grandfather, this 92-year-old man's grandfather, Pike had paid him in gold coins. Since Pike had to leave so quickly, people were coming to murder him, he never got to dig up his old buried coins, so there was a good chance, the old-timer told Bob, that it was still out there. Bob then discovered that in the early 1900s, some men had gone to where the cabin once sat before being burned, and these men found carved beech trees, and they went to the center of them, where they dug up $100,000. They went to the center just like Bob had by the creek, really. But intriguingly, there was supposed to be a second pot of gold on Pike's property that no one had yet found, and it was estimated at $80,000 worth of 1860s gold. To look for this treasure, Bob invited Bob Tilley and Don over to Pike's property. They were going to go looking for the treasure. But now Bob had more information. At first he thought the gold he found may have been outlaw gold, but with Pike in the picture, this may very well be rebel gold, as in that first jar he found last episode. Not only might it be rebel gold, but rebel gold the two Bob's families, Bob Brewer, or Ashcraft, and Bob Tilley, the Avants, gold they had helped bury and keep a secret all these years. At Pike's place, the three found the depression in the ground where the first pot had been dug up, and then they found beech trees with carvings further away. One tree even had the word Pike inscribed on it. Another one had the initials A.P., Albert Pike, as well as some symbols on the tree, and still another tree had some strange word. They were hot on the trail, and before long they found metal objects buried in the ground, and they were pointing. Bob had the men walk in a straight line, following the directions of the buried objects, but soon afterwards they discovered, unfortunately, a large hole where it seemed something long ago had been dug up. Was it the 80,000? That didn't bother Bob at the moment, because near the hole they found another carved tree with symbols and arrows. But for that day, they were done with the hunt. Back home, Bob Tilley called his relatives, the Avants, and asked if they had any old documents. He didn't tell them that he suspected his ancestors had buried rebel gold and were hiding it from the authorities, and, well, everyone. But a few days later, Bob Tilley had a memorandum book that his sister gave him. It was Isum Avants, Tilley's ancestors. It was dated 1920. There were rumors that there was Spanish gold at the Avants Mountain. Could there be truth to that? That was why Evil Bob had come to town in the first place, to look for the Avants Mountain Spanish gold. The memorandum book that Bob Tilley had just received, it contained names. Avants, W.D. Ashcraft, J.P. Smith, and James Blaylock, all locals at that time, 1920s. There were payment notations. There was also a spider web of dots in the back with circles and the words Shady, Arkansas, August 23rd, 1920. Was this a map? Bob Brewer certainly thought this was something big. By now in Bob's journey, he was beginning to believe that treasure wasn't only buried in Hatfield, but also in places as far away as 30 miles. And they were all buried using the same system of symbols and spacing and trees and grids. And at this point, Bob enjoyed the puzzle more than the gold itself. And I, too, am enjoying this puzzle more than the thought of finding gold. I mean, this is every kid's dream. I dreamed of this exact scenario when I was a kid. The thought of finding hidden rebel gold from the Civil War in the deep woods and hills and rock formations in the storied sand caves that surrounded my neighborhood in northern Georgia. And knowing what I know now, there may have been some truth to those dreams. To get some help, Bob and his wife decided to film a short video showing the symbols and trees and asking if anyone knew anything more. They then passed these videos around at various treasure hunting conferences, and soon they were getting leads. Eventually, Bob came to realize that these signs were everywhere in the South, and even in the American Southwest. But nobody knew what a single one of them meant. Bob might be the only person alive who did. Or at least, the only non-initiated person. One fellow treasure hunter from down in Louisiana, a man named Stan Vickery, he suggested that Bob and he get together. After Stan drove up to Bob's, he showed Bob photos he had taken down in Louisiana. The photos had trees with symbols carved, nearly identical symbols. And before long, Stan and Bob were on their way to Ackworth, Georgia, to meet up with some other treasure hunters following a similar grid and symbol map. On the drive east, Stan gave Bob a book titled Jesse James Was One of His Names, the greatest cover-up in history by the famous outlaw who lived 73 incredible lives. While still in the car driving, or I guess riding, Bob flipped through the book until he saw a picture of tree carvings. Carvings of turtles, horses, donkeys, birds, turkey tracks, the initials JJ, and more. They were captioned Golden Circle Treasure Sign. He then read a 20-page chapter that outlined the Knights of the Golden Circle's dealings after the war. Gettler, the author of Rebel Gold, he wrote, quote, "The clincher, however, came 2 chapters later in a startling 20-page section entitled The Fabulous Confederate Treasure Troves. He read there that at the Civil War's end, with the people of the South starving and the region in chaos, a hidden confederacy based in Nashville, Tennessee, had buried enormous caches of gold, silver, and arms for the South to rise again. The stockpiled caches, ranging from those that could be dug up by shovel to those that required enormous mechanical lifts, were hidden in a complex cross-border depository system. The symbols are not always arrows, turkey tracks, snakes, and birds, but sometimes they are the old Confederate Army code. Every venture old Jesse James organization did was in multiples of 3s, 5s, and 7s. The gold and silver specie and bars said to be buried in the Confederate troves, stretching from Florida to California, was in the hundreds of millions and possibly billions of dollars in current value, it said. End quote. Now that is wild, and it makes me want to go exploring right now. But if true, this conspiracy is huge, and there's a good chance the KGC didn't end after the war. The year 1916 was given for when they went completely underground, and Jesse James was one of his names. They say that's when the KGC decided to seal their records until the last Confederate soldier died, which would be in 1959. Bob also realized so many of the symbols and numbers made sense now. He was elated with the possibilities that were unfolding. This time, though, Bob kept his mouth shut. He needed to do some more research. Stan and Bob eventually made it about 40 miles northwest of Atlanta to the forest, where even more clues were on the trees and on the rocks. He found a carved Indian smoking a pipe, a boot, a man wearing a crown, and on a stone he found a carved turtle. Unfortunately, where the lines pointed, the men could not go. It was private property. But it did answer the question of, how far geographically does this stretch? And at least to Georgia. In the year 2000, U.S. News & World Report wrote in their Mysteries of History issue, quote, Jesse James Gold, He died in 1882, or maybe he didn't. Some say he lived into the 1900s, burying gold in New Mexico and Texas to finance a second civil war in which the South would rise again. Now, let's talk about Jesse James. This is going to be his full biography. We'll pick up Bob's story in the third and final episode. The biographies tell us Jesse Woodson James was from Missouri, or from Kentucky and moved to Missouri, or from both. I'll get into that later. He was born of Robert and Zerelda James on September 5, 1847. His mother was very tall and pretty, we are told, and she had a fiery tongue with a wit to match. His father was a preacher of the Protestant-led Second Great Awakening phase of the United States, the same phase that saw Joseph Smith start the LDS Church. Religion was of utmost importance in those days, just as important in Clay County, Missouri, as it was in New York State. Jesse was the third son born to his parents. The first son was Alexander Franklin James, or Frank, and the second son unfortunately passed away. His father was said to have baptized 64 people in one day, so Jesse came from a family of firm believers. A passion for faith that Jesse would carry over into the Civil War, and then into the Knights of the Golden Circle. Although preaching was his father's passion, in 1851, as did many other Americans and seekers of fortune, Jesse's father headed west to California, not to seek gold, mind you, but to preach to those seeking riches over faith. Jesse's father would write to Zerelda shortly after arriving in California. He wrote, "Pray for me, that if we no more meet in this world, we can meet in glory." Unfortunately, Jesse's father succumbed to the same illness so many would face when traveling west, and the fate of so many of us 90s kids who traveled the Oregon Trail on government computers. Jesse's father died of cholera, only 1 month after arriving to the Golden State. According to the customs of the times, the family farm went to creditors and Zerelda and her sons were bereft of a home. She was 25 and had just given birth to a daughter named Susan. The 3 children went to stay with a family friend after Zerelda remarried, but this new husband didn't like the kids. And eventually, after missing her children enough, Zerelda went to be with them, and only a few months later, the second husband would also die. So now she had 3 kids and no home yet again. Naturally, Zerelda married a third time, this time to someone younger who would hopefully outlive her. This man's name was Dr. Reuben Samuels. After this marriage, the man gave up being a doctor and became a farmer. Finally, the family was able to be stable again. Stable enough for another daughter named Sarah to be born. And with the family's hemp income, they were able to own 7 slaves, which helped them even further. And on this farm, Jesse learned to ride, shoot, explore, and be independent. He also attended school regularly with his older brother Frank and younger sister Susan. Then, the 1850s arrived. Bloody Kansas. The bitter divide between free staters and quote-unquote border ruffians. The North flooded the territories of Kansas and Nebraska with armed abolitionists, so the South responded in kind, and they sent men named Border Ruffians, a name they greatly enjoyed. One infamous pro-slavery extremist entered Missouri in 1854 with the explicit goal of getting rid of the abolitionists. This man, David Atchison, would carry under his belt 2 Bowie knives and 4 revolvers. He would write to Jefferson Davis, then Secretary of War, and he said, quote, "We will, before 6 months rolls around, have the devil to pay in Kansas and this state. We are organizing to meet their organization. We will be compelled to shoot, burn, and hang. But the thing will soon be over. We intend to Mormonize the abolitionists." End quote. And I found that phrase very interesting. Mormonize. as in drive them out by whatever means necessary. Missourians had successfully kicked out one group they despised, and they were prepared to do it again. And the abolitionists were just as zealous. Among the men who fought in Kansas was one John Brown. He was good at killing, and as we know, he will go on to Virginia and do it again in the name of abolition. This was all a terrible precursor to the Civil War. Both the North and the South railed against each other over Kansas and Nebraska, and even Missouri. And this was all in the lead up to the ultimate conflict. By the end of Bloody Kansas in 1856, Missouri had become deeply divided between pro-slavery and abolitionists. The late 1850s also saw the rise of the KGC in Missouri, especially after the battles in Kansas. During all of this, Jesse's mom, Zerelda, the attractive, tall, and sharp-tongued woman, would become an ardent pro-Southern, and her sons followed suit. By the time the Civil War began, Bloody Kansas had quietly spilled over into Missouri, as the Kansas Redlegs, as they were called, raided towns along the border. John Brown had invaded the state, killed slave owners, and freed blacks a whopping 8 times. He was hailed as a hero. Missouri militias guarded the border. Everyone knew the war was coming. And when it did, Jesse's older brother Frank, who was 18 and able to join, he sided with the Confederacy, although Missouri would technically stay neutral. Jesse, assuming the war would be over before he even turned 14, was probably jealous. But mostly he was proud of his older brother. They were pretty close, as is evidenced by their future relationship. So perhaps Jesse was also sad to think his brother may not come home at all. But since the war would only last a year, there was little use in thinking of that. Frank and his new fellow soldiers marched off in June of 1861. None of them had a uniform, and some of them didn't even own a gun. At first, the Yankees, with their German militiamen, seized the day, and the arms, and men, of the Confederacy in Missouri. Their leader, Lyon, took St. Louis and then Jefferson City. But it was short-lived, and not long after, the rebels, led by KGC Castle leader and Texas Ranger Ben McCulloch, took back those cities and eventually rendezvoused with Private Frank James' unit under General Price. Missouri was one of the most divided states during the war. It was a border state, after all. As Price and McCulloch swept north with victories, Unionists retreated from their homes and headed towards Kansas and Iowa. But the rebel numbers swelled with each victory. In Clay County, where the James Gang had lived and farmed for some time now, the pro-Confederates were in charge, and most of the county's residents were pro-Secesh. And as Price conquered most of the state, the pro-rebels rejoiced. But that would change in September of 1861, when the Yankees forced Price, Frank James, and all the other rebels back to the southwest corner of the state. The governor and his Secesh cabinet went into exile and declared the state for the South. A Unionist governor took over. Martial law was declared by John C. Fremont, and he said if you aided the rebels, you would be killed. A secret network of detectives flooded the state, sniffing out any pro-Confederates. They were to, quote, scour the country and arrest all enemies, end quote. Fremont also freed all the slaves, although Lincoln would have him reverse that order. Union soldiers began capturing civilians who even had a quote-unquote air of rebellion. And they would be put on trial for treason. Missouri had the most of these trials during the war, and they were tearing Missouri apart. And it seems Lincoln had lost control of the state, even though he claimed it for the North. In early 1862, the Yankees threw out the exile government, and Price resigned from the militia. He would then join the Confederate Army, and most of his men would follow him. he was plotting a return campaign. Author T.J. Stiles in Jesse James, The Last Rebel of the Civil War, describes a reaction to all these northern measures and wins. The very success of Union efforts, however, merely weeded out the weak and disorganized insurrectionists. The smarter, tougher, angrier rebels survived and grew more skilled in the ways of partisan warfare. From the Mississippi River to the Kansas border, small bands continued a deadlier, if less pervasive, guerrilla struggle. They were not a new phenomenon. They, too, emerged from the slaveholding county secessionist fervor, which had grown out of the border ruffian mobilization. Under the pressure of the Union counteroffensive, these secessionist guerrillas broke into small cells that fought without central direction or official Confederate sanction, passing under the nickname of bushwhackers. End quote. Frank James was soon to find himself among these rebel outlaw insurgents, the bushwhackers. But not before catching the measles in Springfield, being left behind by his men, getting captured by the North, and then being paroled on the promise that he would not fight again. He would not keep that promise to a traitorous nation. By March, Frank was back at the family farm, and in that month, Federals would occupy Clay County. The Federals were going from hill to hill and farm to farm, looking for anything and anyone aiding the rebels with food or arms. One man in this region of Missouri decided he'd had enough, and he began to fight back. That man's name was William Clark Quantrill. Quantrill was from Ohio, but he had fought during Bloody Kansas before heading to Missouri, where in 1861 he began fighting the Union. In the words of author T.J. Stiles, Quantrill was, quote, hardly the only guerrilla leader in Missouri, perhaps not even the best, but he came to be remembered, revered, and reviled, as was no one else. End quote. Quantrill became notorious. Once the Union was aware of him, he was enemy number one. But he always evaded capture or death. He ambushed federal patrols. He robbed stagecoaches. He persecuted Unionists throughout the state. He was hell on horseback. After hearing the Yankee leader Halleck say that all guerrilla rebels were to be executed, he killed a Union prisoner of his, and he said, quote, Halleck issued the order, but we drew the first blood. End quote. Quantrill's actions had mostly been contained to Jackson County, which bordered Clay County. But when the Clay County residents heard of what he was doing, they rejoiced, especially the James family. But of course, Quantrill's success led to Union reprisals, and they would come hard for the James family. But before that, on July 22, 1862, the Union military leader, Major General Schofield, issued an order demanding all able-bodied men to sign up for the new enrolled Missouri militia. But, quoting the Major General, disloyal persons or sympathizers with the rebellion are required to report at the nearest military post or other enrolling station, be enrolled, surrender their arms, and return to their homes or ordinary places of business. Frank was then forced to mark himself down as disloyal. He'd already fought for the rebels. He couldn't now fight for the Yankees as well. Not that he wanted to anyways. But with this act, the government did away with any neutrality. 52,000 additional men signed up for this militia, and this meant they were traitors to the secesh crowd, and they would act like it eventually. They were unpaid and untrained, which obviously a bunch of untrained and undisciplined men without uniforms or pay let loose upon the land is a horrible tactic, unless that was the plan all along. Because now you had neighbor against neighbor. Centrists had either left, been turned into Yankee part-time soldiers, or rebel Confederate bushwhackers. There was no middle ground. Jesse James found himself on the side of the rebels. For him, it wasn't invading Yankees that were the threat. It was his neighbors. In February of 1863, the military government created yet another militia. This one had men hand-picked from the first militia, and these men were trained, and they were paid, and they were going to be much more violent and efficient. A lot of these men that would now patrol Clay County were from the northern counties, the Union counties. They were strangers and dangerous men. Frank James had had enough, and in May, he saddled his horse, loaded his pistols, and rode off. He was going to go ride with the bushwhackers. And ride he did. Within weeks, he and a handful of other men, led by Fernando Scott, had killed a German Yankee lieutenant, his Clay County trader guide, and another soldier on a bridge. Over the next several days, Frank, Scott, and the bushwhackers went on a tear, raiding and plundering neighboring counties until they returned to Clay to weed out the Unionists. In response, 2 militia companies went in hot pursuit of Scott and Frank's small gang. By May 25th, after an exciting month, Frank led his small team back to his farm, where he knew he'd get a warm welcome. Jesse was only 15, but he begged to join him. They said he was too young, but he could help by loading up their guns. And I'll quote author Stiles for a little on one of the guns. And I own this gun, and I use it for my Civil War reenactment group here in New Mexico. The 1851 Colt Navy revolver. Quote, the most common pistol in use in Missouri was Colt's 1851 Navy model, a .36 caliber revolver, which had not yet been adapted to take the new all-in-one metal cartridge. Instead, each of the 6 chambers in the revolving cylinder had to be filled with gunpowder and a lead ball, which was then rammed home and sealed with a bit of grease. A percussion cap containing fulminate of mercury had to be filled on a nipple outside each chamber. When struck by the hammer, the cap would set off the charge inside. Loading was such time-consuming work that each guerrilla carried 4 or even 6 revolvers into combat, simply drawing a new pistol when one was emptied or jammed. Loading was also dangerous. According to one account, Jesse blew off the tip of the middle finger of his left hand while loading a Navy revolver sometime in 1863. End quote. Now, that last part about his finger getting blown off, that may or may not become important later when I talk about a certain J. Frank Dalton. Loading my 1851 is much easier since we don't put balls in them, for obvious reasons. Although sometimes when rushing the boys in blue with hundreds watching, I'm kidding. Scott, Frank, and the boys stayed a little while as Jesse and the slaves tended the field. And it is out in the field on this late Missouri day when Jesse was suddenly grabbed from behind, hands around his throat. The militiamen had caught up to Scott's bushwhackers. And at this point, I'll let Stiles take over for a minute because he sums it up very nicely. They dragged him and whipped him, or beat him, or choked him, or pricked him with sabers, depending on the account, his feet sinking into the soft, upturned dirt, scraping through the fragile green tobacco plants all the way to the house. He saw militiamen everywhere, carbines and pistols in their hands, the unknown faces of Clinton County provisionals interweaving with those he recognized, the despised Clay County Unionists of Captain Garth's Company L, apparently led by Lieutenant John W. Younger. In the front yard, in the center of a circle of troops, was Reuben, timid and terrified, aged beyond his years. Lieutenant Henry C. Culver of the Clinton Company hammered him with questions about the bushwhackers. Reuben pleaded ignorance, but Culver had information enough to damn him. Frank James had been identified as one of Scott's men. Fresh reports put the band close by. The militia judged him to be speaking falsely, Lieutenant James H. Rogers reported, and at once procured a rope, placed it about his neck, and gave him one good swing. At that moment, as the rope was tied around Reuben's neck and tossed over the limb of a sturdy tree, Jesse's uncle, William James, appeared. A Baptist minister, like his late brother Robert, he too had heard of Frank's role in the guerrilla mayhem and decided to ride out to see the family. Jesse's mother, the pastor recalled, was making such an outcry and giving them such a tongue-lashing as only she could give. William urged Zerelda to be quiet, whereupon she wheeled in his direction. "How can I be still," she howled, "when they are hanging my husband?" End all quotes. While Zerelda pleaded with the militiamen and her husband squirmed in the air, the militiamen suddenly released him and repeated the questions. This time, Reuben spilled his guts. He told them everything, betraying his wife and her children. He then led the militiamen into the woods where Frank and Scott and the boys were hiding. Once Scott's gang realized what was happening, they took off running, but 2 comrades were shot. They ran through the woods as fast as they could with their things, and they regrouped, but the militia caught up. 3 more of Scott's men would die. They ran for miles through the countryside, and all the while, the Missouri Unionists were hot on their trails. They crossed farms and fields and roads, and finally the Missouri River, which they quickly rowed across on small boats as bullets whizzed through the air. After the shootout, the militia came back to the farm and arrested Jesse's mother, Zerelda, and her broken husband. They were taken to St. Joseph. Now, Jesse was in charge of the farm, although Zerelda would return in about a week. And then a week or so after her return, Reuben ambled into the house where he had betrayed his stepson. There's no mention of how Jesse felt about his return. Amazingly, later that year, Zerelda would give birth to another girl. She would name her Fanny Quantrell Samuel, just to have a Quantrell in the family, she had quipped. I will never forget the first time I saw Quantrell. He was nearly 6 feet in height, rather thin. His hair and mustache was sandy, and he was full of life and a jolly fellow. He had none of the air of the bravado or the desperado about him. He was a demon in battle. Frank James to a Liberty, Missouri newspaper in August of 1863. In that same month, Quantrill would ride into Lawrence, Kansas, with Frank and 450 other men, and they were hell-bent on revenge. Once they had galloped into the city, Quantrill yelled, quote, "Kill, and you will make no mistake. Lawrence should be thoroughly cleansed, and the only way to cleanse it is to kill, kill." End quote. They would indeed kill a lot of civilians. The Yankees retaliated with ordering the complete evacuation of 3.5 counties, although not Clay County. The civilians had 15 days. This area became known as the Burnt District. What the Missouri and Yankee soldiers did there would be repeated by Sherman in his march to the sea. I recently watched The Outlaw Josie Wales after reading for this episode, and I believe the novel the incredible movie was based on was modeled after the many bushwhacker stories from this era. Frank would ride with Quantrill all throughout that year and even into the next. At some point, and I think this is important, but at this time, Frank, Quantrill, and the bushwhackers rode into Texas for the winter. And I believe it is here that Frank probably became a KGC Knight, or at least learned heavily about it. Another man I'll mention in a minute, Bloody Bill Anderson, was also there. He too was a knight. So in May of '64, Frank would pay a visit to his family. It's here that Jesse will join them at 16 years old. He was finally ready to fight. And it was a fight that would last the rest of his life. Supposedly. Over the next several weeks, the James boys and their bushwhackers killed at least 8 Unionist civilians. 2 of them had been present when the militia raided his farm, and they had whipped or beat him. One of his fellow guerrilla fighters said of Jesse, quote, "Not to have any beard, he is the keenest and cleanest fighter in the command." End quote. In retaliation, there were ambushes laid upon them, and they also laid ambushes, They got into some skirmishes, they plundered, they swelled their numbers, and they killed. It was a rough and tumble time for the young Jesse James. But clearly he was meant for the role. And he enjoyed the ride. He never claimed otherwise. Not even almost 100 years later. Eventually, Frank and Jesse would hook up with none other than the 25-year-old Bloody Bill Anderson. William T. Anderson had grown up in the border states, and after his father was killed, he became a road bandit. And then the war started. One of his sisters would be killed and 2 more would be injured in a Union concentration camp for women. It was a simple building that they were being held in, and it collapsed. 5 women were killed. Many more wounded, including Bill's sisters. In the spring of '64, Bloody Bill had broken away from Quantrill and was now leading his own set of bushwhackers. In July of '64, he wrote a letter to the newspapers addressed to Unionists. It said, quote, "I will hunt you down like wolves and murder you. You cannot escape." End quote. Some of his men became infamous for scalping their dead victims. Jesse James apparently only scalped 1. Here is the author Styles' description of Bloody Bill Anderson. He stood a slender 5 feet 10 inches in his captured Union officer's coat, quick and lithe in action as a tiger, whose nature he at times possessed, wrote one observer who spared no tender feelings for the guerrilla leader. His hair was his greatest ornament, a mass of shoulder-length, brown, wavy strands that surrounded a tanned face with a full beard, topped by a cavalryman's hat. Most striking were his eyes, a blend of blue and gray. They were cold, unsympathizing, and expressionless, never firing in anger or lighting with enthusiasm in battle. And yet, by all accounts, battle is what he hungered for. End all quotes. Jesse and Frank accompanied Bloody Bill on his raids and killings as the Union troops killed and burned Southern sympathizers' homes. Bloody Bill's numbers would eventually reach upwards of 75. Then, at some point, while they traipsed through Missouri, Jesse saw a fine saddle on a fence. So, he hopped off his horse and went to grab it. But just then, boom, he took a bullet to the chest. The man who fired the bullet was a German immigrant who fled through a cornfield. Frank helped Jesse climb back in his saddle, and they rode for 3 more miles before the shock wore off and the pain flooded in. Once he was off his horse, the bushwhackers liberated a wagon and placed him in the back. They were off for a Secesh compatriot's house who may be able to help him. During the bouncy ride, Jesse was to have said that he hurt so bad he wished the Federals would catch and kill him. Eventually, a doctor friend who'd known Jesse since he was a boy rode through the dangerous country all the way from Kansas City. Once the doctor had gone through the trap door to the attic, he saw that the bullet had gone clear through his chest. There was very little the doctor could actually do. It was no matter, though. Jesse recovered in about a month. Amazingly. And by September, he was back out with Bloody Bill. Although things had taken a turn for the worse. The bushwhackers had surprised 12 troopers and killed them and their black teamsters, but on the same day, Bloody Bill lost 6 of his own men, with the 7th taken prisoner. Oh, and the Union troopers, they scalped his men. Later that month, Anderson met up with about 100 other bushwhackers, including Quantrill, because word on the street was that General Price was coming into Missouri to liberate it, and they were going to help him take back the state. Bloody Bill did not believe this, though, but he was still hopeful that it was true. Before them, Anderson convinced the other group, which combined were anywhere from 200 to 400 men. Anderson convinced the other bushwhackers to attack the Union garrison at Fayette. They would sneak through in the morning, wearing captured Union coats, and then they would unleash hell. That was the plan, anyways. The attack turned out to be a disaster. The town and garrison were alerted to the presence of Anderson's men when one of them shot a Negro in a Union uniform as they snuck forward, thus killing the surprise attack. Unionists then barricaded themselves in the brick courthouse. The garrison ran to a fortified log cabin. The guerrillas didn't stand a chance. They were cut down as they approached the Yankees. Frank James would later recall, quote, "We were in plain view of the Federals and they simply peppered us with bullets. I was mightily scared. I knew if we raised up we would expose ourselves to the fire of the Yankees, and we couldn't stay still. I tell you, pride makes most of us do many things we wouldn't do otherwise. Well, pride kept us there until we got the wounded rolled up in a blanket, and then we made tracks." End quote. Anderson lost 13 of his almost 400 to the Reaper, and 30 were wounded. Frank later admitted they got whipped. But in contrast, at around the same time, General Grant led 115,000 men against Lee's 67,000. And further south, Sherman led almost 100,000 men down into Georgia. In Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, the North fought with 37,000 men against the South's 15,000. The Confederacy never stood a chance against the sheer number of men constantly streaming in off ships and the sheer number of production of materiel that the North could create. Likewise, these bushwhackers were a drop in the pond compared to the ever-growing number of Federals in Missouri. This was no longer a winnable war, if it ever had been. And it especially had not been since Gettysburg and Vicksburg. These men, these bushwhackers, and every other Confederate soldier, they were fighting for something much stronger than a possible victory. Maybe by now, Frank and Quantrill and Anderson and maybe even Jesse knew what they were doing was futile. But maybe they could in the future do something to resurrect what they believed in. But it may have been a bit too early for such rhetoric. After the failure at Fayette was the looting of Centralia, which was a very important milestone to Jesse's future, specifically the robbing of the train. Bloody Bill had his men pile railroad ties in front of the train to make it stop, and all the while the bushwhackers rode alongside the slowing train while firing into the windows. This haul allowed them to steal thousands of 1860s worth of greenbacks, the secesh term for American dollars. Then the men broke into the passenger cars, where they saw them filled with blue-coated Yankees, fresh off of Sherman's march through Atlanta. An episode I am admittedly still bitter about, being from North Georgia myself. One of the bushwhackers told them to surrender and you will be spared. One Yank replied, "We can only surrender, as we are totally unarmed." And here's how Stiles, the author, describes what happens next. As the train emptied, Anderson strolled down the platform beside Clement. As usual, Bill had a cavalry hat on his head, a Union officer's coat on his shoulders, and pistols strapped outside a pair of black pants. He waved the civilians to one side, where his men shoved them into two files. He pointed the soldiers in another direction, ordering them to fall into line. Two of them hesitated as they came down the steps, whispering to each other. Anderson pulled his pistol and fired 2 shots, and they tumbled to the ground. The remaining passengers rushed to obey his orders, stutter-stepping out the doors to their assigned positions. Jesse, like the other guerrillas, would have been cursing civilians and military men alike, cocking his pistols and pointing them at the prisoners. End quote. Next, Anderson had them strip and line up, and then he asked if there was a superior officer among them. After a repeated asking, one finally stepped forward, a certain Thomas Morton Goodman. They would use him to get their captured men back. Bloody Bill then said, quote, "You Federals have just killed 6 of my soldiers, scalped them, and left them on the prairie. I am too honorable a man to permit any man to be scalped, but I will show you that I can kill men with as much rapidity and skill as anybody. From this time forward, I ask no quarter and give none. Every Federal soldier on whom I put my finger shall die like a dog. If I get into your clutches, I expect death. You are all to be killed and sent to hell. That is the way every damned soldier shall be served who falls into my hands." End quote. The soldiers obviously protested. They said they hadn't scalped anyone. They'd been down in Georgia with Sherman. They left out the part where they raped and destroyed and burnt and left destitute every structure, beast, and civilian they saw in my home state as they made their way to the coast. Bloody Bill, though, he replied, "I treat you all as one. You are Federals, and Federals scalped my men, and carry their scalps at their saddle bows." And with that, the signal was given. All but one of the 23 soldiers perished the way a soldier is expected to die, with bullets or the butts of rifles, if they survived the onslaught of lead. Jesse was there, and he participated. After the executions, Anderson had the tracks cleared, the train set afire, and then he put it to steam to barrel down the tracks, engulfed in flames towards its final destination. Not long after Centralia, the Yankees went in hot pursuit. A battle followed which saw Jesse James gun down the commanding officer while galloping through the lines of fresh Missouri recruits. As in, the Missourians were all lined up, and Jesse James and a couple others rode their horses directly at them. Bloody Bill Anderson's bushwhackers demolished the Federals. They left no one alive that they could find. Only a few straggled back to the next town. Anderson lost less than a handful of men who gained 17 scalps that day. Shortly after this Bloody Bill affair, which took place in anticipation of a rebel invasion from the Confederates, the Southern commanding officer Price did indeed invade Missouri. And then he fought an ill-conceived battle at Pilot Knob, south of St. Louis. During that battle, Price lost 1,500 men while the Federals lost only 28. The campaign had already failed. But Price still held a celebration in a town called Boonville that Jesse James attended with his brother and his commander, Anderson. Of course, they got a thanks for their efforts, but they were also told to head in the opposite direction of Price's army, an army which was retreating, unbeknownst to all Secesh Missourians. Jesse James, during these last gasping moments of the war, would ride with Anderson as they fought and killed, looted and pillaged, and then finally went into battle one last time. On October 27, 1864, during a daring charge, Bloody Bill Anderson fell for his own game of taunting the enemy, and he rode into a hail of gunfire. I will post his posed death photo on the site for this episode. At nearly the exact same moment that Anderson was killed, Joe Shelby lost a critical battle in Missouri, and the Confederate Army would permanently retreat. The War of Southern Independence in Missouri was over. And soon it would be over for the entire rebel government, who had been fighting a second war of independence against a tyrannical foreign government since 1861. Jesse James had fought a brutal war, a war that would change him forever. After Anderson's death, Frank headed to Kentucky, while Jesse headed to Texas, a state ripe with KGC castles and influential men who ran them. This may be when and where he got his education. This is probably when he got initiated. And this may be where he realized he needed to secure a future, not only for the Missourians, but for the entire nation, the destroyed nation of the South. On April 9th, 1865, the war was over, but not for Jesse James. He would fight for this war until the end of his life, whether that be in 1882 or the mid-20th century. On May 15, 1865, Jesse and a comrade were on the Salt Pond Road, possibly on their way to surrender 2 days before they agreed to do so, but while they rode, they stumbled upon some Wisconsin Yankee cavalrymen who wasted no time in pulling out their pistols and opening fire on the two rebels. Before Jesse and his friend could react, Jesse had taken another bullet to the chest. this time from a Navy Colt revolver. The bullet would never leave his body. The other rebels fled while Jesse's horse fell beneath him. He climbed out from under the horse and ran towards the woods with blood pouring from his chest. 2 cavalrymen went in pursuit. Jesse turned and killed one of their horses, which caused the other cavalrymen to end the pursuit. Jesse would later say, "I was near a creek, and I lay in the water all night. I felt as if I was burning up. The next morning, I crawled up the bank, and there was a man plowing nearby who helped me get to my friends." It had been another extremely close call for Jesse James. But this was the true end of his unsanctioned Civil War activities. Soon after, his friends escorted him into Lexington and up into a hotel bed, where on May 21st, Jesse and his bushwhacking gang took the oath of allegiance to the United States of America. Even 4 months later, Jesse still feared he would die. After having been transported to his mother's new house in exile in Nebraska, he took his mom's face in his hands and said, "Ma, I don't want to be buried here in a northern state." So the next day, they took him back to Clay County, Missouri. He would not be better until October of that year, and he wouldn't be fully healed for another 2 years. Curiously, his family never actually corroborated this story. And author Stiles flat out doesn't believe it. He thinks this was a cover for what he did during these 2 years. Could he have been studying the ways of the KGC? After rioting and plundering with such prolific bandits, he may have been a prime candidate for continuing his subversive ways for the cause. But by October, both Frank and Jesse were back at the house they'd grown up in. And eventually his old wartime friends would come stumbling back. And the band was back together again. And they had a plan. On February 13th, 1866, as the Radical Union's revolution was sweeping through the South, the Clay County Savings and Loan was robbed. As the bandits left, they rode hard for the east with their pistols firing into the air. They'd just stolen $58,000. This was America's first daylight bank hold-up robbery. It's safe to say the James brothers were among these bushwhackers who were named. It was their old crew. The only man who named the James brothers later retracted his statement after being threatened. The response from the radical government was mostly in vain, but laws were passed, Missouri militias were back on the streets, the Republicans took every major office, they formed their own bushwhackers, and they formed their own secret radical militant societies. And the ex-rebels fought back. In 1866, many believed a second war was coming. But this time, it would be the radical revolutionary Republicans who had forced a new government on the people they just conquered. Many thought they were the ones who would start this second war. It wouldn't be a war of independence for the South, but a war of eradication by the North. This was the rhetoric at the time. One Missourian would say, quote, "Have we not good reason to apprehend another civil war? A war or two in comparison to the atrocity of which the last one was a mere nothing. And I say, let the issue speedily come. There is not on the face of the earth a body politic so foully disgraced and so wretchedly misgoverned as ours. Yankee avarice, Yankee intolerance, Yankee oppression, Yankee hypocrisy have so permeated our whole country that it is as rotten as a dead Dutchman." End quote. Ex-Secesh Missourians had no representatives. Missouri rebel leaders were all barred from office, or in Mexico, and all ex-rebs were barred from voting. The only rebel leaders left were the bushwhackers, Jesse James included. If Jesse had been initiated into the KGC order by now, he may have also believed he and his fellow bushwhackers may be the only thing keeping Missouri alive. And they may have been preparing for this second war by stealing Yankee treasure. If round 2 broke out, they'd all be even better prepared than the first time. And it was the same organization, the Knights of the Golden Circle, that would form its southern foundation. On October 30th, 1866, in Lexington, Missouri, the Alexander Mitchell and Company Bank was robbed of $2,000 in broad daylight at around noon. Two ex-bushwhackers and friends of the James brothers witnessed this brazen robbery, gathered a small posse of other ex-bushwhackers, and they gave chase. But alas, they just could not catch up with the bank robbers, and they got frightened when one of the robbers shot at them. That's a great story. In December, though, the probable leader of this band of bushwhackers, and best friend and mentor to Jesse James, Archer Clement, was killed in Lexington. Jesse would never forget this deed done by the Yankees. But it did open the door for the 19-year-old to become the leader of this gang of bushwhacking rebels, who were seemingly continuing the fight. On May 22, 1867, in the town of Richmond, Missouri, the Hughes and Wasson Bank was robbed at 3:30 in the afternoon. As 4 men commenced the robbery, the rest sat on their horses outside the bank, watching, waiting. And that's when someone in town gave a shout, and a battle erupted. The residents of the town took up their arms. The mayor was shot through the heart. A Yankee lieutenant took a bullet in the forehead. The lieutenant's father also took a bullet to the skull. $3,500 had been taken. This time it was confirmed that the James brothers were among the participants. The search for the bushwhackers began immediately. A posseman was killed and the robber got away. A horse thief was lynched from jail. Yet another suspect was lynched from jail. On November 27th, the First National Bank in Independence, Missouri was robbed. The bushwhackers took $18,000 in gold. 2 confirmed suspects were lynched after being caught. Again, if Jesse and his bushwhackers, who all rode with men of the order in these early days, if they'd been initiated, they may have already begun to amass and hide the rebel treasure in the Missouri hills and woods. On March 20th, 1868, the Nimrod L. Long & Co. Bank was robbed in the afternoon in Russellville, Kentucky by the James Gang and other bushwhacking associates. They made $12,000 total, with $3,000 of it being gold. On December 7th, 1869, Frank and Jesse shot a man dead in a bank in Gallatin. Jesse had incorrectly identified him as a man who killed Bloody Bill Anderson. When the 2 brothers were making their getaway, Jesse was thrown from his horse, but his leg was caught in the stirrup, and he was dragged about 40 feet on the road. Frank, noticing his brother had been dropped, turned around, held out a hand, and helped his brother leap on the horse behind him. The 2 men rode away with Jesse thinking he'd avenged his dead friend. But a week later, the law came to Zerelda's, where the James brothers were hiding. But just as they were about to open the door, Zerelda's 13-year-old black servant swung it open and ran straight for the barn. The law just stood there in confusion as the boys swung open the barn doors moments before Jesse and Frank bolted out on magnificent horses. They rode straight for the fence and then jumped over it, all the while being fired at by the posse. The head of the posse was the only one to pursue, since his horse, and his alone, was also able to jump the fence. As the brothers fired at him, the posse leader dismounted and took a shot, but he missed. And worse, his startled horse took off after the James brothers. Once the horse caught up to them, one of the brothers pulled the horse close and shot it dead as they raced away into the woods. After their escape, they rode into nearby Kinney and intimidated the locals into covering for them, a pattern they would repeat. After this incident, a $500 reward was offered for their capture. In 1870, one of General Shelby's closest confidants and fellow soldiers was an author named Major John Newman Edwards, and in that year he sought out to meet the James brothers, whom the ex-Confederate greatly admired. 3 years prior, he and Shelby and the ex-rebel government, and the lot of them, had traveled back from Mexico when Juarez won back the country from Maximilian. The brothers and Edwards would be lifelong friends. Edwards would write about the 2 brothers and say of James, quote, There is always a smile on his lips and a graceful word or compliment for all with whom he comes in contact. Jesse laughs at everything. Frank at nothing at all. Jesse is light-hearted, reckless, devil-may-care. Frank, sober, sedate, a dangerous man always in ambush in the midst of society. Jesse knows there is a price upon his head and discusses the whys and wherefores of it. Frank knows it too, but it chafes him sorely. End quote. Edwards also introduced them to other, more powerful Southern ex-Confederates, which again leads me to believe he was already an initiate in the KGC. In August of 1870, both Jesse and Frank headed to Texas, where they would stay until February of 1871. It is unknown what they were doing during that time. On June 3, 1871, the James brothers increased the coffers of the KGC, or at least themselves, when they stole $3,000 from a bank in Iowa. And during this robbery, the entire town was outside listening to a popular speaker of the era. As they left, they shook the bags of money at the unsuspecting townsfolk. The posse would find them 2 days later, and a gun battle would erupt. During their escape, one of the bushwhackers accidentally blasted another one with a shotgun, but the victim stayed in the saddle as they rode away. It was Frank that was injured by his own men, possibly Jesse. In a surprising turn of events, by 1870, the radical Republicans had lost all power in Missouri, and soon ex-Confederates and secessionists would be in charge of the state. This change would eventually turn Jesse James from evil outlaw to cultural hero. Edwards, Jesse's new friend, was in the Democrat Party, and he was rising to power and helping the Democrats along the way. He'd also greatly helped Jesse James. Edwards wanted another Confederacy, and he was going to use the KGC to get it, or they were using him. After the Iowa heist, Frank James somehow managed to get himself back to Texas to Shelby's ranch. He was filled with buckshot and bleeding from the lungs. He'd stay there for over 2 months to heal. One of the gang's members would be caught and tried for the heist, but he was acquitted. So Jesse stayed low in these months. After the gang had reunited with a healed Frank, on April 28, 1872, they robbed another bank in Kentucky. But the bank teller they shot in the chest refused to open the safe. He would rather die for the money than give it over to the bushwhackers. And he did die. The gang got nothing. On September 27, 1872, they would brazenly rob the Industrial Exposition Fair in Kansas City with thousands of people around. They would get less than $1,000 though, because they had arrived moments too late. If they'd gotten there 30 minutes earlier, they would have walked out with $12,000. Their friend, Edwards, would write in the Kansas City Times that, quote, "It was a deed so high-handed, so diabolically daring, and so utterly in contempt of fear that we are bound to admire it and revere its perpetrators for the very enormity of their outlawry." End quote. For weeks, Edwards would write valiantly of these robbers. Robbers he knew well, although the public didn't know who the bandits were yet. And then Edwards printed an anonymous letter from one of the robbers, probably written by Jesse James. A part of it reads, quote, "Some editors call us thieves. We are not thieves. We are bold robbers. I am proud of the name, for Alexander the Great was a bold robber, and Julius Caesar, and Napoleon Bonaparte." End quote. The anonymous author and robber then said that, don't worry, they don't keep the money. They, quote, "rob the rich and give to the poor." End quote. As you have guessed, and as I will tell you soon, they did not give to the poor. They gave to the cause. I'll read one more part of the letter, though. It states, quote, "Just let a party of men commit a bold robbery, and the cry is hang them. But Grant and his party can steal millions, and it is all right. It hurts me very much to be called a thief. It makes me feel like They were trying to put me on a par with Grant and his party." End quote. This would be Yankee General and Republican President Grant. Jesse James was more than a bushwhacker or common criminal. He was now a political figure. But he was a knight of the Golden Circle. He knew what was at stake. And I should quickly say, no biography, well, there are biographies I will talk about later. No researcher or historian can confirm that Jesse James was ever in the KGC. So maybe he wasn't. But as you'll hear about with Bob Brewer in the next episode, he clearly was. And of course the burden is on me to prove it, which I cannot, but I can tell the story of Jesse James and the two books I'll talk about, or the two authors, I guess, I'll talk about at the end of this episode. And then in the next one, you'll hear all about Bob Brewer and the Wolf Map and the Lost Dutchman Treasure and all of Jesse James' many names and lives he had during his life and after the coward Robert Ford. But I am jumping ahead a little bit. The public eventually came to realize who the robbers were, which pretty much forced the James gang underground at this point in 1872. But it was no matter. They had a different target in mind now. One much more daring and much more filled with the promise of immense riches. While James and Frank were intelligent men, and they may have been inspired by Bloody Bill, but it is very unlikely, unless they were told by people in the know, it was very unlikely that they knew how the brand new banking system in America worked, and how intimately it worked with the railroads. There is a very good chance that the James gang were given instructions on what to do next by a higher power. Maybe Shelby, through Edwards, and maybe Shelby was being steered by Albert Pike. Those facts will never be known, but deciding to hit the railroads was an ingenious way to steal millions in 1873. Even in 1872, their friend Edwards began writing about how the millionaire train company owners were oppressing and stealing from the common white man, not only in Missouri, but all around the South. He even wrote that someone ought to make this injustice against the poor man right. Hint, hint, Jesse and Frank James. On July 21st, 1873, the gang robbed their first train. This was in Iowa. They chose a location where the train had to make a sharp turn, and to accomplish this, the train had to slow way down, lest they topple over. The nearest building occupied by humans was 4 miles away. No one would be able to sound the alarm. As the train approached at 8:30 at night, the men yanked up 2 rails, and the train came to a deafening halt. For an incredible visual of this, watch the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, although this is not the scene depicted. For on this night, the first 4 cars of the train slid off the tracks and toppled over onto its side in a horrendous crash. Only one passenger car fell over, the smoking car. Jesse hopped into the car he knew was filled with money and yelled, "If you don't open the safe or give me the key, I'll blow your brains out." The man gave Jesse the key. The take was only $2,300. "Where's the rest?" Jesse shouted. The man who had handed the key said that was all that's in there, unless you're talking about those bags. In those bags was 3.5 tons of gold bullion on its way from the west to New York. But it was too heavy to carry, so they just left it. The money they'd been after had actually left on the train before, so they needed better spies. And they needed a way to transport the tons of gold bullion they were bound to find. Stiles says this of their first train robbery: Plunder remained the bandits' prime motivation, but they now displayed a growing determination to make statements with their crimes. After all, this is a large part of why posterity remembers these men out of history's many forgotten gangsters. But the James brothers and their Confederates did not yet have a completely coherent political program when they struck the Rock Island Railroad in 1873. End quote. I would slightly disagree, but I've already said it like 10 times. In January of 1874, the gang robbed a stagecoach in Louisiana before robbing one in Hot Springs, Arkansas. They would flee that robbery on their way back to Missouri through the woods of Bob Brewer's family. He would drop the treasure off with the KGC Sentinel families of the Ashcrafts and Avants, and a few others. And these men were to bury the treasure using coded KGC symbols and lines that had been invented by Albert Pike, who lived just outside of Hatfield, Arkansas, at one point. During the Hot Springs robbery, they asked if any man had fought for the South. When one man raised his hand, they returned his watch and money. They weren't robbing from any Confederates. Indeed, they said they were robbing for them. Not long after the stagecoach robbery, on January 31st, they trapped a train in far southern Missouri. They stole $1,000 before looting from the passengers. The bandits, in their white hoods, seemed happy. One was quoting Shakespeare. They returned to Minister's belongings and asked him to pray for them at one point. But again, their total take was only $2,000. But this robbery prompted the Pinkertons to get involved. And that would end poorly. One agent showed up to their house to try and infiltrate, as in the Jesse James house, Zerelda's house. He tried to infiltrate, but he didn't last an hour. He was found dead in a field a few days later. 2 more agents would be around town when they were ambushed by some members of the gang. One agent was killed, but one of the gang was as well. Captured. The celebrated Jesse W. James taken at last. His captor a woman, young, accomplished, and beautiful. That was written by Jesse's friend and protector, Edwards, in the June 9th edition of the St. Louis Dispatch. In April of 74, Jesse married his cousin Z. Mims, or so the story goes. And Z was short for Zerelda. It is a little strange. The wedding was interrupted when the false report of Pinkerton agents approaching forced the men to arm up. But it was false and the wedding would resume. The two would honeymoon in Texas at Jesse's sister's house. His sister had also married a bushwhacker. So, that is true. Or, alternatively, Z. Mims married a different man who was also a known robber and bushwhacker and rival of Jesse. Jesse instead may have married Martha Jane Pressgrove, or another name I'll mention later, doesn't really matter. And there are photographs of somebody who looks a lot like Jesse James with a different woman, many photographs. The truth may come out one day, and maybe at the end of this episode. But for now, all of that is unsubstantiated, so we will stick with the he married Z. Mims story. By now, the James brothers were well known everywhere they went. They made no effort to conceal their identities. Meanwhile, Edwards in St. Louis was constantly defending them and growing their reputation. People feared them, and people revered them. The James brothers represented what many Missourians and Southerns were no longer allowed to be proud of: the Confederacy. The governor of Missouri now offered a $2,000 reward for the brothers, and a secret police force was formed to hunt them down. On Jesse's return from Texas, it is assumed he robbed a few stagecoaches, likely handing some of the loot to the men in Hatfield, Arkansas, or even just burying it in Arkansas or Texas or Missouri himself. By now, he and the gang were robbing trains with white hoods over their heads with eyes and a mouth hole cut out. Some newspapers identified it as the style of the KKK. And it's tough to find what the original outfits looked like, but clearly the white hoods, without a point, were used in the original iteration of the secret society, which may or may not have been the militant wing of the KGC. On August 30th, they robbed a train after it had stopped, but their target wasn't there. That was no matter. They robbed the male passengers of their belongings. And I will let Stiles describe the rest of the amusing robbery. The brother's companion, however, noticed a few Sunday strollers walking nearby. He rode his horse over to them and ordered them to join the prisoners outside the stage. "I know you," one of the pedestrians replied, "in spite of that dirty old veil over your face." She was a young woman from Lexington named Maddie Hamlet, and she had known the James and Younger brothers during the war. Her keen eye for faces, however, was not matched by a memory for names. She referred to the man in front of her as Will Younger, but there was no brother by that name. When she walked over to the omnibus, she recognized the sharp blue eyes and upturned nose, albeit masked, of the young James boy who had come into Lexington at the end of the war, badly wounded. But she called him Frank instead of Jesse. "Why, Frank James," she said, putting a hand on Jesse's arm, "I'm astonished to see you have come down to such small work. I thought you never did anything except on a big scale." He warmly shook hands with her and made no effort to correct her mistaken identification. "Well, I am a little ashamed of it myself," he cheerfully replied. "It's the first time we've ever stooped to such small game, but you needn't call names quite so loud here." As he pulled money and watches from the man's pockets, Hamlet interceded on behalf of some of the victims. Jessie handed back the driver's gold watch at her request, but kept the chain. "No," she huffed. "Give back the chain, too. I won't have part, if I can't get all." He reluctantly complied. End all quotes. This robbery had taken place in front of hundreds of onlookers. The news would spread. But there were conflicting reports. The woman who recognized him would change her story after a visit from Zerelda and Edwards, and the James mother would insist that they were in Mexico and they may never return, so it could not have been James or Frank. On December 8, 1874, the gang robbed another train, this one in Muncie, Kansas. Their haul was a whopping $30,000. As they left, someone, probably Jesse, yelled, "Goodbye, boys, no hard feelings. We have taken nothing from you." After this brazen robbery, all totaled up, the reward for catching the thieves came to $13,500 for each one of them. And now, the boss of the Pinkertons would personally take up the case and travel to Missouri to hunt them down. This time, he would team up with Unionists who had hated the James brothers for over a decade, or at least a decade. After gathering a team and infiltrating Clay County in early January 1875, the posse lit Zerelda's house and barn on fire before throwing in a bunch of an early version of an incendiary grenade. The Jesse boys had left a few hours before, but the rest of the family and their Negro farmhands were still inside. Reuben and Zerelda attempted to throw the grenades back out, but they just kept leaking fire. Reuben threw one of these little grenades into the fireplace, where there was already a fire, and as the family huddled in the room wondering what to do next as the house began to burn down, the incendiary grenade exploded. After this, the posse of Pinkertons fled the scene while firing their guns towards the house, even though no one was firing at them. Zerelda's small son Archie had a piece of the incendiary grenade that had just exploded tear through his bowels. Reuben and Ambrose, an ex-slave, were hit in the head, and Zerelda had her right wrist shattered. Little Archie was not expected to live through the night. When he was brought to his mother as he was dying, she prayed for him. The boy's last words were, "Tell my mama I'm better." Zerelda would lose half her right arm to amputation without anesthesia. And she would be lucid enough to hold a coroner's jury the night after the amputation. She would later say, quote, "I used to be a woman of fortitude and resolution. It is all gone now. I could stand anything but this." End quote. Little Archie would be buried in a fine suit of Confederate gray. Despite the tragedy, the authorities were soon at the house to arrest the men of the family. Zerelda, of course, told them, as they were being taken away, to keep their mouths shut. One resident of Clay County called it the gayest thing of the season. Obviously, the entire bloody fiasco created even more friends for the James gang. And Edwards had a field day. He would write, quote, "Men of Missouri, you who fought under Anderson, Quantrill, Todd, Poole, recall your woodcraft and give up these scoundrels to the Henry rifle and the Colt's revolver." He continued, "It is not for the robberies they are accused of that Pinkerton hates the James brothers. It is because, like you, they were at Lawrence and Centralia and wherever else the black flag floated and men neither knew nor wanted quarter." End quote. The James brothers, Edwards, the newspaperman, their friend Shelby in Texas, they were all parts of a still wide-spanning organization that was preparing for the outbreak of the Second Civil War. Allegedly. The Grant administration, by now, was giving up on Reconstruction, and the ex-Confederate states were rewriting their 1865 constitutions as old rebels and their allies began holding office after almost a decade of being shut out. The rhetoric was one of occupation and invasion by radical Republicans and their revolutionary ideas that were destroying the South. Those views, opposing the Republicans, were winning. It sure looked as if the time for a second Civil War was approaching, and the James gang would have probably been its symbolic leaders. In April, Jesse would allegedly kill one of the Clay County men who had housed the Pinkerton men for 3 months before they killed his young brother and tried to burn down his mother's home. He shot this man 3 times in the head. He then rode to a neighbor's house and said, "We have killed Dan Askew tonight, and if anyone wishes to know who did it, say that detectives did it. Tell his friends to go and bury the damned son of a bitch tomorrow. Will you do it?" End quote. It was a common tactic of bushwhackers during the war, and they're just continuing it now. Zerelda denied that it was either of her boys that did the murder, but she said the man made many enemies during the war. He had been a Yankee soldier. After this, local sheriffs stayed away from the fight. Wells Fargo gave up on hunting him down. A bill was passed in Missouri that limited the amount of an award by the state for criminals. It had only been bumped above 300 4 times, and all 4 times were for the James gang. Even Pinkerton gave up. He would no more pursue the rebel hero Jesse James or his gang. Although Jesse would, for the rest of his life, no matter how long he lived, fear a Pinkerton behind every tree. In the summer of 1875, Jesse and his wife, whichever wife, moved outside of Nashville and changed their names. so they moved from Missouri to Nashville. Jesse, during this time, would frequently be gone for long trips, and when he returned, he would fire the help and hire new ones. Neighbors and friends of this new couple to town reported how they constantly had diamonds, gold, and rolls of greenbacks. Was Jesse gathering loot while being led by the KGC to various treasure sites to bury the goods, draw up maps, and lay the necessary signs in the earth to the initiated with the help of sentinels? Bob Brewer certainly thinks so. Where did Jesse James go during these long trips? Certainly Kentucky, but also no doubt Hatfield, Arkansas, maybe northern Georgia. He did go to Chicago, Illinois, where he sought to kill Allan Pinkerton, but that chance never came. In August, his wife would give him a son named Jesse Edward James, after his friend and writer. One reason he may have left Missouri is because the political ambitions of his group to turn Missouri from radical Republican to ex-rebel Democrat was pretty much complete. His job there was done. He had miraculously succeeded, with the help of Edwards and countless other men. But Jesse's whereabouts in late 1875 until mid-76, it's a bit of a mystery. I've already covered, and will cover in a bit, what some people think he was up to. But if you'll recall, the book Jesse James Had Many Names claims that the KGC after the war had moved its headquarters to Nashville. That was a quote I opened with. And Nashville is the same place where Jesse now resides. Jesse James had become a powerful symbol for the resurgent South and a leader of anti-Reconstruction. He had proved that in Missouri, maybe the secret society thought it was time to expand his reach. Because again, the books I read about, like the sanctioned books you can buy at Barnes & Noble or whatever, they don't say why he moved to Nashville at this time. Changed his name. He had gone other places, and he hadn't changed his name as far as I know. But this time was different. And during this mysterious time, Jesse and his gang probably robbed a bank in West Virginia. It's even rumored that he briefly moved to Baltimore, where, by the way, in 1934, two boys found 5,000 gold coins buried by the KGC under their house. I encourage you to look that up. By July of 1876, though, Jesse was back in Missouri, and a whole bunch of new recruits and volunteers had saddled up with him. And then on July the 6th, at a place known as the Rocky Cut, they robbed another train. This time they robbed it with immaculate precision and knowledge of what was on board. Everyone was wearing their mask except for the leader, Jesse James. They robbed 2 safes, but spared all the passengers. Jesse said something to the effect of, "We've already been here an hour. Best leave." He then told the engineer, "Now, Cap, you can take your damned old machine and go ahead." The total loot was $18,300. This time, it was noted, Jesse handed out everyone's share. The gang had grown beyond its original intended purpose, and not everyone was in on the game. At this point in Jesse James' life, author Stiles remarks of the robberies and the planned string of them. He writes, quote, "On the surface, a second robbery made no sense. Nothing could be more dangerous than collecting together so soon after a big raid. And money would not have been their motivation, as the Missouri Pacific operation had been unusually lucrative. What would prompt this departure from well-established and highly successful procedure?" End quote. If the stories are to be believed, the answer lies with the KGC. By late August of 76, the James gang was in St. Paul, Minnesota, for the next score. They were there to target one man in particular. They were targeting the ex-military governor, carpetbagger, radical Republican race trader, and later civilian governor of Mississippi, Adelbert Ames. That's how they would have seen it. This man now lived in Minnesota, and he was doing quite well for himself. How Jesse, the planner of this heist, knew this? Obviously, it was handed down to him when he was in Nashville, headquarters of a certain organization. Jesse had been enveloped by Missouri politics and strife nearly his entire life. He was well-read, yes, but he probably was not keeping up with Mississippi politics at this time, at least not until he moved to Nashville. The order to hit Ames and his money came from a well-organized body of men who desired to continue the decline of the post-war Republican Reconstruction government. Authors and researchers can explain away the insane reasons why they think Jesse James and his gang were in Minnesota in '76, but I'm convinced it was not his idea. But he was by now, especially after his time in Tennessee, completely on board with the cause. After all, he'd already succeeded in Missouri. Now there was the bigger picture. And also, there was a lot of money to be stolen. On September 7th, the James gang were in Northfield, Minnesota, Ames's current residency, where he was depositing a lot of money in the First National Bank. The robbery was a disaster for the James gang. An epic gun battle ensued. 2 gang members were dead and 2 more badly wounded. 2 more gang members were captured later, and another was killed in the largest manhunt in U.S. history up until that point. The escape from Northfield was far from pleasant for the rest of the gang. It rained the entire time. Half of them were wounded. They were extremely cold and soaked and very hungry. They would split up after a few days, and Jesse and Frank would trudge ever forward through guards and pickets towards the Dakotas. They'd get peppered with shotgun pellets, which wounded their legs. They rode and walked hard for 10 days in the rain, which left them barely able to walk. But finally, they would reach the Dakotas. They were, after all, experienced guerrilla fighting bushwhackers who knew exactly how to evade capture. They never had any doubt that they would make it. South of Sioux City, they ran into a doctor who asked them for directions. They then forced the man to switch clothes with Jesse and forced him to dress their wounds before they stole his horse and they disappeared. Their trail would never be found. Almost 3 years later, John David Howard, one of Jesse's many aliases, was living in Tennessee. Frank lived nearby and was going by Woodson. By all accounts, Frank was tired of the outlaw life, and he now had a son, and he worked 10 hours a day, a legit job. Frank would quit cursing, and he made friends all throughout the town. It would be untrue to say the James brothers buried all the stolen loot, for in Tennessee in these years, they never lacked money. Jesse and his family would move into Frank's home in '79. It's unknown what Jesse did for these 3 years, but I have a feeling it involved Rebel Gold. Rebel Gold Bob Brewer we'll dig up later. I'm also unsure if Jesse really ever went to Las Vegas, New Mexico and met Billy the Kid. But if he did, it would have been around this time, which was the same time his wife gave birth to their daughter. And I am still on the fence with that story. I didn't believe it at the time, but knowing what I know now of the vast treasures buried by Jesse James across the nation, I do believe in these 3 years he was active in traveling the southern and western and southwestern states. Billy the Kid wasn't the same kind of bandit as the James Gang boys were. He was barely a bandit at all. Although they have a similar backstory. Later in 1879, Jesse would go back to Missouri, to the home of Joe Shelby, where he met with old comrades, fellow knights, and family members. He was also there, recruiting for a job. Frank may be done with the outlaw life, but Jesse sure wasn't. He had a lot more to accomplish. On October 8, 1879, Jesse and his men, back in Missouri, would rob a train they thought had $380,000 worth of gold on it. That train, though, had gone elsewhere, but they did score $25,000. Shortly after that, an ex-Confederate bushwhacker claimed to the press that he had killed Jesse James after infiltrating their gang. Other ex-bushwhackers confirmed the story. They swore on it, as did even more people. But no body, Jesse's body, could not be found. Was this a ruse by Jesse and his old comrades? Would he try this again in a few years? But on that occasion, he'd be able to produce a body. And then the alleged killer would travel the country performing a play on his killing to hammer home to everyone that Jesse was in fact dead. When the real Jesse James lived to be over 100. I am skipping ahead a bit. Jesse had not been killed, but he was instead near Nashville. Again, the then supposed headquarters of the KGC. This would not be the only time that Jesse tried to fake his death. In August of 1880, Jesse and his now growing gang, although without Frank, the gang held up a stagecoach in Kentucky and scored an impressive loot. They then robbed a mine, also in Kentucky. And all the while, Jesse owned racehorses, which brought him thousands of dollars every race. And also at this time, when he was in Georgia, Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee, the people close to him said he would spend days in the forest. Was he scouting new locations or burying his treasures? In March of 81, Jesse and his gang held up a U.S. Army engineering crew in northern Alabama. They got over $5,000 in gold and silver. But their identities have been discovered, so Jesse and Frank were forced to flee Nashville, and they had to send their families away. Frank James, despite not desiring to, was back with Jesse in the life of an outlaw. On July 14th, they robbed a train. They only made out with a pathetic $600. Jesse killed the conductor. He would later say he was sorry about that, until he learned the man had been involved with the raid on his mother's house that had killed his little half-brother. On September 7th, 1881, they robbed another train, their supposed last. The safe was empty, so they had to steal from the passengers. During the robbery, Jesse acted kind of strange. He stole 50 cents from the brakeman, who complained it's all he had. So Jesse gave the man $1.50 back and said, "Here's your 50 cents with interest." Another woman fainted during the robbery, and Jesse responded with wetting a handkerchief and patting her face to revive her. He gave her back the dollar they stole. He then apparently said, quote, "If you are getting tired of holding up your hands so straight, why, slip them around behind your head and rest them. I suppose most of you put your hands up 2 or 3 times a day. I suppose the detectives will all be here in a day or 2. They will all come on free passes, but they won't find us here. They can't stop us from robbing trains. It's our business. We could do it just the same if the baggage car was full of soldiers." End quote. Jesse apparently walked the cars, quoting the Bible, and he said, "If we are going to be wicked, we might as well make a good job of it." As he left, he bowed and said, "Goodbye. This is the last time you will ever see Jesse James." He then went to the front of the train and gave $2 to the engineer. He told him, quote, "You're a good one. Take this and spend it with the boys. You'd better quit running on the road. We're going to make it so hot for this damned Alton Road, they can't run." End quote. This is the train robbery in the opening scene of the incredible movie, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. I've gone on for far longer about Jesse than I had planned. Mostly because, like Billy the Kid, Maria y Pacheco, Baylor, and countless other men I have studied, I gained an immense amount of respect for the man and began to sympathize and admire him, even with his murderous faults. I have never said this in my show before, but you should watch that film, which accurately tells the supposed final year, of James' life. But I will very briefly summarize his quote-unquote end. By 1882, the era of Reconstruction was over. Most Southern states were in the hands of ex-rebels. The Civil War seemed far in the rear-view mirror. The days of hating the railroads was also over. The people were looking for peace or towards the Western territories. The future felt real again for America. Jesse's public persona had waned, and he had become more paranoid. And the price on his head was over $10,000 by now. It may be a good time as any to die, or fake your death. In March, Bob and Charlie Ford moved in with the James. From the beginning, we are told the Fords had planned to kill Jesse. But once they got in with him, their resolution began to falter. But the opportunity finally presented itself in April, as they were planning a splendid little bank robbery. Jesse put on his nice clothes, and he and Charlie Ford went out to feed the horses. When the two came back into the house, Jesse looked at the two scheming brothers and remarked, "It's an awful hot day." He then took off his coat and his vest, and he threw them on his bed. He looked around for a moment before saying, "I guess I'll take off my pistols, for fear somebody will see them if I walk in the yard." He then went back into the living room where the two Fords stood. Jesse looked around until he saw a dusty picture on the wall. He grabbed a brush, pushed a chair against a wall, and began idly cleaning the pictures. The last thing he heard was the sound of the hammer being cocked on Bob Ford's pistol. When Jesse's wife ran into the room, Bob Ford said that the pistol had gone off on accident. Z replied with, "I guess it went off on purpose." The Ford brothers would be pardoned, although Charlie would kill himself later, and Bob would be killed by a man who was avenging Jesse. This man would walk into Bob's tent in Creede, Colorado, and say, "Hey, Bob," before unloading his shotgun into the man. Frank James would be acquitted of all his crimes, and Jesse would leave very little, almost nothing, for his wife and children, which is surprising considering how much he stole and made on horses. Unless, of course, he was stealing for something bigger than himself. Just like when Billy the Kid had died and everyone testified it was their favorite young outlaw laying there on the floor, everyone from Z to Zarelda confirmed this was Jesse James' body. All the scars were there, and a DNA test in 1995 even confirmed it. Although, I will talk about that debacle a little later, because it was totally a farce. But still, what if Bob Ford had been in on it? What if this had been planned with the help of a secret underground Southern society? Jesse had stolen $250,000 that we know of. There was probably more. Not to mention, train and bank robberies were happening all over the nation in the 1870s by ex-Confederates who felt shut out of a nation that had conquered them. In the May 19th, 1948 edition of the Lawton Constitution, an article appeared titled, "Jesse James is Alive in Lawton." The article covers a local resident named J. Frank Dalton, who claimed to be the alive and over 100-year-old Jesse James. He claimed he had the scars, rope burns, bullet holes, and tattoos to prove it. In the article, Dalton talks about buried gold, maps that he had made, and a code that is not easy to break for the uninitiated. The article further says, quote, "Jesse declares that there still are many of those caches untouched by human hands since they were buried years ago. But he is an old man, and money no longer means anything to him. Besides, too much blood has been spilled already over the inglorious gold which sets the very blood of mankind racing with greed. Leave it for the individuals who are capable of working out its puzzles and solving the secrets of nature's most severe problems," Jesse confides. End quote. Now, while he is very convincing, I don't believe this man was actually Jesse James, but he did know Jesse James, the old Jesse James, as in the man who lived long after his supposed assassination. Many at the time, in the 1940s, they dismissed Dalton's claim, but he went kind of viral for that time. One person certainly believed him, though, and that was the author of Jesse James was one of his names. The authors were Del Schrader and Orvis Lee Houck, and Houck is named Jesse James III. That book describes how Jesse was a KGC leader who was stashing gold for his second Civil War after the KGC went completely underground. The book also talks about how many prominent Southerns after the war became titans of certain industries for the sole purpose of raising funds for the sequel. There were railroad men, mining men, timbermen, banks, racehorse breeders. I almost want to write a fiction book with these men as some shadowy group that the main character... No, I don't want to give it away or have anyone steal my idea. Jesse James was one of his names, was published after the last Confederate soldier died. So the authors, who knew Dalton, they assert that they didn't write this sooner because KGC members, ex-Rebs, and friends who knew Jesse James, quote, don't take kindly to revealing exact directions on how to open the many Confederate depositories scattered across the land. End quote. The book also asks this important question, important to us and this episode, and certainly important to Bob Brewer. They ask, quote, did Jesse command a gang, or as chief of the Knights of the Golden Circle, did he direct the activities of the Confederate Underground Army, which was preparing for a second Civil War? End quote. And it's a good question. Jesse certainly worked with ex-Confederates, which author Ralph P. Gannis asserts in his 2000 book, Uncommon Men, A Secret Network of Jesse James Revealed. Gannis does come to the conclusion that he did work with ex-Rebs, and they were most likely KGC. Gannis doesn't believe that Jesse faked his death, but Gettler and Rebel Gold certainly entertains it. And that is mostly because of the book Jesse James was one of his names. But there are books that will come out later after Gettler publishes Bob Brewer's Rebel Gold, and I will talk about that at the very end of this episode. Here is some more evidence from the book. It states there were 2 Jesse James. They were cousins. One was from Kentucky, and that would be Jesse Woodson James, and one was from Missouri. That would be Jesse Robert James. They both had brothers named Frank. They both fought as Confederates. They both were in the Knights of the Golden Circle. Interestingly, these 2 authors, if charlatans, and also Dalton if he was a charlatan, if they were all lying, they certainly knew a lot about the KGC and Jesse James, including the fact that the KGC did not disband after the war, and they kept their headquarters in Nashville until 1884, at which point they would have one in Texas and one in Colorado. The book claims that Jesse W. James, or Dalton, stole Union payrolls to demoralize them and to take the money. He raided in the American Southwest, the Rockies, the South, and even into Mexico. After the war, he stuck to mostly Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and Kentucky. The authors also say that Jesse was in the inner sanctum of the KGC, so the 3rd level, maybe? Which doesn't quite add up to what I told y'all earlier from Keene's book, but maybe by the end of the war they were a different set of men. Apparently, Jesse W. James would sometimes raid these places with the help of Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Cherokee Indians. And now this is where it gets incredibly interesting. After the war, Joe Shelby decided he was not going to surrender, so he crossed the Rio Grande with some of his men, including Edwards, and they attempted to help out Emperor Maximilian's faltering regime down south. While Jesse W. James, who was deep in the KGC ranks, took some of his men down there to rescue the general when the emperor was killed. And apparently the emperor rewarded Jesse James with multi-million dollars in gold. And they were all minted in Mexico. Jesse and the Rebs brought the gold back up, and for his efforts he was made Comptroller General of the KGC. So Jesse was now in charge of all of the secret society's funds. This would have been 1867. Now the problem with this lavish story is that he had been spotted in Missouri at a bank robbery in May and again in November of that year. I doubt he would have had time to scurry down to Mexico, rescue a bunch of ex-Rebs, get paid a whole bunch of gold, and then go back through the Juarista lines and hostile French troops, make it back to Missouri, and rob banks before and afterwards. Unless, of course, there were 2 Jesse James, cousins with the same names and the same cause. Then later, again, according to the book, Jesse W. James offed a rival who was using his name during robberies. He then put this rival's body in the coffin at his funeral, had the governor of Missouri, a KGC member, sign off that it was indeed Jesse, and then the governor pardoned a bunch of the gang members. It is curious and an actual fact that Jesse grew a long beard and dyed it black towards the end of his life, to look just like the man who he supposedly killed to take his place. And listen to this, y'all. One of Jesse's friends, and also a gang member, was a black cook named John Trammell. John Trammell was implicit in the murder of the rival and the replacement of the body, according to the book. After the fact, John Trammell fired up some bricks, carved some KGC words and images into them, and then buried them to commemorate this incredible deceit. So I will just quote Gettler now, because this is wild. Whether apocryphal or not, the bricks were eventually dug up in 1966 and written up with photos in the St. Joseph, Missouri newspaper. The images inscribed are telling. One brick contained an image of a Spanish dagger, the numerals 777, the letters KGC and JJ. Of course, KGC and JJ stood for the Knights of the Golden Circle and Jesse James. Schrader and Houck vouch. Trammell died at the age of 118 and outlived J. Frank Dalton to become one of the oldest living Americans at the time. Trammell was the subject of a November 8, 1954 front-page article in the Colorado Springs Gazette-Telegraph entitled, 116-year-old Jesse James Gang's Cook Visits Region. It describes Trammell as a confidant of Jesse James and a subject of a scientific research project into 25 of the oldest people in the world. In the article, Trammell describes himself as a general handyman of the rebel James Gang after the Civil War. The article states, quote, one big reason why he came here was to show Jesse James III of Manitou Springs, a great-grandson of the famed Jesse, the location of 2 caches of gold coins, gold and silver bullion, which the original Jesse reportedly buried in the Ute Pass area in 1876. End all quotes. And Jesse James III is Houck, so Houck is claiming to be Jesse's grandson. Y'all, there really might have been rebel gold in the hills I grew up in. Heck, there might be rebel gold in the mountains I live in right now in New Mexico. This story is crazy, and the whole series is crazy. I hope y'all are enjoying it. The book goes into the other Jesse R. James. He fought with Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson during the war. And then he met up with his cousin in Florida, so the Jesse James cousin. And the 2 authors of Jesse James, was one of his names, describes an interaction where the 2 Jesse Jameses, are using code. They talk about turkey tracks and turtles before saying, all right, we're in the same organization. They don't explain the meaning of the turkey tracks or turtles, but Bob Brewer had seen countless etchings and petroglyphs with those symbols, not just in his woods, but in Georgia, and Stan from Louisiana showed him. He will, in the next episode, as you'll hear, he will see them in Oklahoma and Arizona. And later, after this Rebel Gold book is published, he will find them in Texas and even more places in Oklahoma and New Mexico. I'm sure Bob Brewer was reading this book on the edge of his seat on that drive, just like I was reading his book. The Jesse James book then explains about the 2 Jessies and 2 Franks and about how they were never going to set the record straight. Quote, the 2 Jesse James and the 2 Frank Jameses were not about to set the record straight. The 2 sets of composites were working fine for them in their secret work. All 4 were unreconstructed Confederates. All 4 felt their mission in life was to help the South rise again. End quote. So Gettler then mentions that while this may be crazy, Jesse James was credited with nearly simultaneous robberies in entirely different parts of the country, such as the Corinth, Mississippi bank heist on December 8th and the train heist in Muncie, Kansas the very next day. And you might be thinking, well, maybe he and his gang rode a train. But nope, even that is not fast enough to make it to the next stop in less than a day. Now, obviously, I find it funny when Gettler brings up the meeting between one of the Jesse James and Billy the Kid in Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1877. And I dismissed this outright in my Billy the Kid series. But, I still do. But if there were 2 Jessies, maybe. Very cool to think about, and a lot less outlandish if any of this is true at all, in any way whatsoever. And now you might be wondering if I believe Dalton's story, and I don't, but I do believe he faked his death. And I believe Dalton met the real Jesse James and kind of co-opted his story. but I'll get into that in a little bit. Very incredibly and exciting, the two authors of the Jesse James book are, Houck and Schrader. They say that Dalton, aka Jesse James, told them that there were over 100 sites of buried Confederate treasure in the United States. The treasure was normally near streams, rivers, railroad tracks, stagecoach stations, old mills, and cattle trails. They say the treasure is mostly in Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, Ohio, and even the Northwest. Amazingly, in the 1960s in Troy, Ohio, a great-grandson of a former friend of Jesse James and KGC member, he dug up several $100,000 of KGC treasure. But the authors do say Dalton told them that most of these treasures were in deep mine shafts or chambers or vaults. Oh, and a lot of them were booby-trapped. Straight out of Indiana Jones. But unfortunately, most of the treasures were now on public land. So the author said you would need to fight through, quote, a maze of federal and state government red tapes, end quote. Never, ever inform the feds that you have found anything on public land. Take that to your grave. Seriously. Like the Forrest Fenn treasure. Whoever found that better never have told anyone where they got it. And as I was writing this and reading this, I began to wonder, because as you'll read with Bob Brewer, a lot of the treasure is on state or government-owned land. And they do not hand out permits to dig willy-nilly. What if in the progressive era when when a lot of these places were deemed federal or state land, what if people in the know had these places protected by these new statutes of public land? So another interesting tidbit in the book, at least interesting to Bob Brewer, was that many of the gold deposits were buried deep in the grounds under the guise of mining companies. Sounds a lot like Bob's family men who had all these mine claims but never found any gold. And obviously that's because instead of digging it up, they were digging it into the ground. This is what the book says, quote, mining companies also employed a network of agents to report unusual activities near the site. The Confederate underground was busy sinking shafts for caches, and this could pass for mining. Golden Circle agents were merciless, and many a snooper was tracked down and killed before he could file a report. Shoot and ask questions later, was Colonel James' standing order to his secret operatives. Another order was, better to kill a man than be sorry. On rare occasions, a Golden Circle agent would violate his blood oath and attempt to slip back and recover some of the buried loot. The man was invariably shot because Jesse kept a concealed guard around a new cache for generally a month. After that, it was periodically inspected to see if it had been tampered with. End quote. Again, Grandpa Ashcraft, Great Uncle Otis. It would have been Bob's duty if he had gone to war. And then the book says this incredible paragraph. On his 100th birthday in 1944, old Jesse told his closest relatives, there are no free and easy Confederate treasures, any that an amateur or tenderfoot could locate and dig out on a weekend. He'd need a hell of a lot of inside information. There is a key to Confederate treasure troves. In 1916, we sealed our Golden Circle records for 50 years. So in 1966, I will be long gone. It won't belong to anybody. I will leave the key to my grandson, Lee Houck, Jesse James III. There are no written records of the caches, just signs and symbols. But Lee will have the key. That I assure you. End quote. Are y'all as excited as I am? As excited as Bob was when he read all this? So the book, Jesse James was one of his names, was out of print at the time Rebel Gold was published. But it is now back in print. And you can find it for $50, but still. It's called The Black Book. And I have too much going on right now, but I have decided among my many other hobbies and responsibilities that I will become a treasure hunter. Indiana Jones sparked it in me when I was a kid. I got my degree in archaeology. But then Forrest Fenn awakened it when I lived in Wisconsin. I traveled every year to the Southwest before I lived here, and only once did I ever even try to look for his treasure. But I had no idea what I was doing, and it was just an excuse to take a hike in a certain area. Now these books and this story have reawakened that spirit in me. And thankfully I have a little son now, so I have an excuse to take him out. Well, not that I needed one anyways. So maybe Dalton was the old Jesse James, or maybe this guy was one of the many sentinels who learned the key and the signs and symbols and was meant to guard it. I don't know. It reminds me a little bit of the brushy Bill Roberts story, which I do not believe at all. I think Billy was killed for real that night in Fort Sumner. But I have come to the conclusion that Jesse James faked his death. Now, another section of the Jesse James book claims that after the war, Forrest, Jesse James, General Shelby, and even Jefferson Davis were later leaders of the KGC. They then say that those leaders placed men in the telegraph offices, the rail companies, and even insurance companies, which enabled them to have detailed information regarding places and trains to hit. Jesse James and the KGC knew which stagecoaches and trains and banks to rob on account of this. In the last episode, I cited the possibility that the KKK was founded by the KGC. And this Jesse James was one of his names book is where Gettler got his ideas on it. The book says, quote, "Concerning the KKK, Jesse admitted it was the secret military police of the Old South, but the Golden Circle really rode herd on their activities. We began folding up the KKK a few years after the Golden Circle sealed its records in 1916. We old-timers had absolutely nothing to do with the modern KKK, which is a different breed of cat." End quote. Now there are, I guess, 3 iterations of the KKK. The Reconstruction, the one I'm about to talk about in about 1916, after a certain trial, and then I think the latest one, starting in the 60s or 70s, I think. So the original KKK did not wear long white robes with white pointy hats. That was the creation from the 1915 film Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. Although, by drawings and written accounts, they did often wear white hoods to mask their appearance. And during their ceremonies, they probably wore white robes. After the Birth of a Nation was released, and after the Leo Frank case and trial, the second KKK was born. That particular trial involved a Jewish pencil factory manager who raped and killed a 13-year-old girl in Atlanta. Leo Frank tried to blame it on a black worker at the factory, but the black dude was dismissed as a suspect eventually. I think he was even kidnapped by white Atlanta residents, but he was released when they realized he was telling the truth. He didn't do it. The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, was created on account of this trial. And when they came out with lawyers and money to defend Leo Frank, the public turned on him. He was clearly a guilty pedophile, rapist, and murderer. And the ADL paid off the then, or not the ADL, I think it was the B'nai B'rith or something. B'nai B'rith. They paid off the then Georgia governor to commute Frank's sentence. And that was when the KKK was truly resurrected. After 1915, the Ku Klux Klan became overtly anti-Jewish. Also, they lynched Frank in Marietta. And by the way, the man who created the KKK costumes for Birth of a Nation was a Jewish man named Robert Goldstein. So maybe the original KKK were the militia members of the very underground KGC. And maybe Dalton really was the never assassinated Jesse James. And maybe Dalton, or James, really did rob all those stagecoaches, banks, and trains for the cause of Confederate resurrection. But that being said, I do doubt that Dalton was James. Although there's a very strong possibility another man is indeed the never assassinated Jesse James. And more on him in a moment. Of note, another book that bears reading is called Jesse James, the Outlaw. It was written by Henry J. Walker, and it suggests that, quote, the robberies and escapades they took part in were not actually of their own planning, nor the plans of their band of outlaws. The James boys were only a small part of a large movement of members of a lost cause in the South. Some of these members were even elected to government positions. Some were employees of the express companies. And this secret organization was financed mostly by a foreign government to make regular espionage reports on the United States outpost forts from 1865 to 1892. Not until this latter date did this spying movement collapse. End quote. So there's a lot to think about there. And I just told you about J. Frank Dalton and Houck, or Jesse James III, and their very detailed, plausible story. But during my research, I came across yet another book, actually a series of books. And these were written by yet another alleged Jesse James descendant. These books were written by Daniel J. Duke, and they are titled Jesse James and the Lost Templar Treasure, and The Mysterious Life and Faked Death of Jesse James, based on family records, forensic evidence, and his personal journals, and lastly, The Secret History of the Wild, Wild West, Outlaws, Secret Societies, and the Hidden Agenda of the Elites. They were published in 2019, 2020, and 2022. So, Daniel J. Duke, he claims that Jesse James faked his death, but his story has the outlaw living in Texas under the name James Lafayette Courtney. Again, Jesse James was only one of his names. Daniel J. Duke, and his mother, who also wrote several books on the subject, Duke claims that J. Frank Dalton moved to Duke's great-great-grandfather's area, which his great-great-grandfather was Jesse James. J. Frank Dalton moved to Duke's great-great-grandfather's area years before he died. And Dalton learned all he could about the man and from the man before Duke's ancestor, the real James, died. After he died, this man, J. Frank Dalton, claimed himself to be the real Jesse James, when in fact he was a pretender. I hope y'all are still with me. Duke has a remarkable amount of evidence to back him up. Houck had the stories and the maps, which he had been given by Dalton. And these maps will prove true, as you'll hear in the next episode. But Duke, decades after J.J. III published his Black Book, Jesse James was one of his names, Duke used the latest technology and resources to bolster his familial claims. In the opening to his first book, he writes, quote, "My mother took our family photos to the experts, And by experts, I don't mean someone who paints for a hobby or has read a few books about photo identification. Mom went to the forensics lab of the Texas Department of Public Safety, the forensic photographic expert for the Austin Police Department, and a company called Visionex, world leaders in facial recognition technology, later purchased by Identix. All three verified that our family photographs and tintypes of my great-great-grandfather, who lived under the alias of James Lafayette Courtney, matched the image of the famous, or infamous, outlaw Jesse James. Not only did the photos of our ancestor match the historically accepted photos of Jesse James, but photos of his mother matched Jesse's mother, down to the very dress she wore. Other family photos matched those of Jesse's family as well. End quote. Duke also had in his possession his great-great-grandfather's diary, which many of them were signed Jesse James. And the real kicker, Duke's mother completely debunked the DNA testing quote-unquote proof from the 1990s. He wrote that his mother proved, quote, that the 1995 exhumation of the alleged grave of Jesse James, upon which they placed so much evidence, was a farce. Stephen Caruso, the deputy counselor for Clay County, Missouri, at the time of the 1995 exhumation and DNA testing of the reported grave of Jesse James, told the Kearney Courier the whole thing was phony. Quote, they, the James Farm and Museum, tried to do DNA testing on remains that weren't Jesse James, end quote, Caruso said. He claimed that someone lost Jesse's hair that was to be tested, but then it suddenly turned up. He also claimed that someone submitted their own hair in place of the lost hair. He told me and my mother in his office who that someone was and exactly how and why it was done. End all quotes. The more I read about Jesse James, the more I became convinced he was not killed by the coward Robert Ford. And Robert Ford was not even a coward, but rather he was in on it. If this is true, it was a very brave thing he did, and he will be killed for it later. Lastly, Duke was given, of course, his great-great-grandfather's maps. Maps that lead to buried rebel gold. Maps that, unfortunately, unlike Bob Brewer, Duke had a hard time solving. Actually, I don't think he ever solves them. But that did not stop him from trying. Beyond claiming that Duke is a descendant of Jesse James, he also claims, like Houck did, that Jesse never married his cousin Z, named after his mother, remember, but instead he married another woman, a different name from the woman I claimed earlier. And Z married the man that would take Jesse James' place in his casket, the casket that was displayed after he was allegedly murdered. And to further muddy the waters, the Duke family asked for the original coroner's report when Jesse James was killed. And surprisingly, they told them those records had been destroyed a year before they asked. The Duke family claim that Jesse James faked his death and took on the name of one of his kin, the Courtney name. And there were plenty of Courtneys around Clay County, which the James clan had grown up in. Not only were the two clans intermarried, but the Courtneys rode with the James gang, and some of them fought with Frank James during the war. And in a diary entry of Jesse James, in his diary, he writes a rhyme suggesting he will steal his family's name, the Courtney name. Hence how Jesse James became James Lafayette Courtney. The Dukes assert that Jesse came to Texas with saddlebags full of gold before he married the daughter of a Texas Ranger. They then had 8 children in Texas, Jesse then began buying everything in gold and even began to apparently bury gold bars around his properties. But he couldn't bury it fast enough. Family members and neighbors saw buckets of silver, tens of thousands of dollars in greenbacks. They saw gold in the outhouse, in the barn, anywhere Jesse James/James Courtney could store it. But there was one detail, actually two. But the first detail I thought was incredible in Daniel Duke's connection between Courtney and James. Duke writes that in Jesse James' journal, he mentions a Confederate Colonel George Bible Pickett, who was the father of Tom Pickett. And if you don't remember, Tom Pickett rode with Dave Rudabog and Billy the Kid over in Lincoln County. Pickett would get arrested with the other two and taken to Santa Fe, but I don't remember his fate. Actually, I could look it up. Or just listen to my series again. Well, it's only 11 parts or something. Well, Colonel Pickett is mentioned in both Jesse James' journal and James Courtney's journal. The other detail is that Jesse James most certainly went to Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1879, after the failed robbery in Minnesota. Even future New Mexico Governor Miguel Ortero claimed to have seen Jesse in Las Vegas at the time that Billy the Kid was rumored to have met him. Now, of course, I can just go and write a book and claim whatever I wanted to as well, but I read all these and I don't know, there's something about them that has drawn me. Maybe I'm too invested in the story being true, but I don't care. It's fun anyways, right? Daniel Duke then cites his great-great-grandfather's journal, aka Jesse James' journal, after he faked his death. In that journal, Courtney mentions a William Roberts living near him in Texas. William Roberts, aka Brushy Bill Roberts, as in the name Billy the Kid went under after he allegedly faked his death. So there are two ways to interpret this. Either Billy really did fake his death, or Brushy Bill Roberts is very similar to J. Frank Dalton. He liked a story that he was told, and he adopted it for himself. And yes, it's funny that I can completely deny one story as being true while totally falling for another. Armed with his great-great-grandfather's journal and map, Daniel Duke attempted to find some gold, like Bob Brewer. The first treasure Duke sought after was the famous New Mexico Victorio's Peak treasure. Now, some background on this mysterious hoard is in order. It is said that Chief Victorio, the Apache, hid this massive amount of treasure in the mountain now named after him. And yes, I will do an episode to finish the Apache series with Victorio. But Victorio burying this treasure seems very unlikely. There's also stories that it is part of the fabled 7 cities of Cibola, which was actually written about in Spain before they discovered the New World, I found out. But that also doesn't add up. Over the years, it has now become associated with, of course, the Knights of the Golden Circle. But it might be a different set of knights who are involved with it. In 1937, while hunting deer, Milton Ernest Doc Noss discovered a covered cave with chests full of coins and jewels, saddlebags filled with treasure, over 16,000 bars of gold weighing over 40 pounds each, Wells Fargo boxes, letters, the most recent dated to 1880. And that is 320 tons of gold, by the way. The Spanish only brought 181 tons of gold from the New World to Spain in the entirety of their conquest. For the next few years after his discovery, Doc Noss and his wife would carry out as much as they could from the massive network of tunnels and caves. At one point, he claimed to have found a crown with 243 diamonds and a giant ruby on it. He also found an old document from 1797, and this document was a translation from the Pope from long before that. Hauntingly, though, Doc Noss also found 27 bound skeletons. Pretty much every story agrees that while trying to expand the massive tunnels or network of tunnels, which seemingly led to even more buried treasure, Doc Noss used dynamite, which of course caved in the treasure and made it impossible to continue exploring. But Doc still had a ton of gold bars that he'd recovered. Problem was, it was illegal to have gold in the 1930s thanks to FDR's New Deal regime. So he had to hide a bunch of it in the desert. Of course, Doc Noss would become increasingly paranoid. He would divorce his wife, remarry, and then be shot in the back of the head. Then, in 1955, the U.S. military increased the boundary of the White Sands Missile Range, which placed the area of the mine under the government's dominion. The story of the mine quickly spread to the enlisted men, and 4 of them, in 1958, found the caverns, including stacks of gold bars. These men, once they were denied permission to extract the wealth, they also used dynamite to seal the cave entrance so nobody could. But oops. Probably shouldn't have done that because in the 1960s the government finally gave them permission to retrieve their treasure. Except now, they couldn't find the cave. Allegedly. And then the army barred anyone from entering the area, and the rest is history. And surprisingly, that history even appears in the 1973 Watergate hearings. Nixon's lawyer, John Dean, said during the hearings that Attorney General John Mitchell had been attempting to look for the treasure using the government and her resources. And former New Mexican Attorney General David Norvell said about the treasure, quote, "There's too much evidence to discount completely the possibility that there's something still in there." End quote. So, Jesse James' possible descendant, Daniel J. Duke, decided he was going to pull the thread of the Victoria Peak treasure. And it led to some interesting places, to say the least. The first place he went was back to the east, to Virginia, to the Bruton Parish Church, where many founding fathers attended. Men like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. At this church was said to be buried, quite literally, the secrets of the world. The 33rd degree Freemason, Manly P. Hall, and Albert Pike are involved in this story. The Rosicrucians are involved, the Knights Templar, even more ancient mystery schools, like the Egyptians, the Babylonians, King Arthur, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, Francis Bacon, Aleister Crowley, the Satanist, Shakespeare, Queen Elizabeth. They're all in this story, and it is wild. It's almost a little bit too much, especially after listening to TLE's Mystery Babylon series. Basically, Duke deciphers the treasure map he has using distances and symbols instead of the KGC template like Bob Brewer is doing. He uses the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. He then connects it to the Catholic Church, the Knights Templar, the Freemasons, and then the KGC. He says they just borrowed these symbols from Freemasonry and buried their treasures the same way that the Knights Templar's descendants, the Freemasons, also buried their treasure throughout the U.S. So essentially, there's buried treasure all over this country, and Canada and Mexico. Also, the template itself is one big esoteric map of significant thought and belief that stretches back thousands of years, like 6,000 years. Duke uses a lot of Hebrew, some scriptures, Kabbalah, the Bible, Torah, famous ancient men, numbers. To read through this in his book is a slog. All 3 books, actually. But he ultimately proves that symbols in paintings and on maps seem to point to important spots in the real world. And this is something that will become paramount in the next episode with Bob Brewer over in Arizona. And the two even mention a lot of the same ancient texts and sources and paintings and maps. At some point in Duke's books, he goes in search of a treasure on the Brazos River in Texas. But both the sites that he is interested in, they were being excavated by Baylor University. And eventually a tombstone led him to what could have been a major treasure site, but when he went to look, Baylor University was building their new football stadium at the exact same spot. And Baylor University was founded by John Baylor of the Confederate Army, his cousin. And John Baylor was, of course, a Freemason and castle leader in the Knights of the Golden Circle. I am convinced that Jesse James faked his death, and then he used various aliases throughout the years to travel the South and the Southwest in his attempts to find and rebury hidden treasure that the Freemasons and the KGC, maybe the Knights Templar, who knows. But he reburied these treasures in his extended lifetime. He and others would also continue to rob trains and stagecoaches before using the secret and ancient template to carve symbols, bury clues, and hide loot throughout the nation, not just in Arkansas, not just in the South. One particular spot that is incredibly fascinating and tempting is the Lost Dutchman Treasure of Arizona. And that spot in the Superstition Mountains, along with a massive treasure in south central Oklahoma, is where we will spend the next and final episode. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, to track a killer lion, lost his fear, man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, was gone out of sound. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters show the chase and fall. Now the lever action rifle and horses change the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me, the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good jib leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good jib sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed her mighty lion. And purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.